Can you help me decide how I should vote? I heard a quote from the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, and we just mentioned that, and the Knights of Columbus. Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight, made a powerful speech. But what about the focus of the justice and the message of peace, peace and justice? This seems to be a tough call this year for American Catholics, and we're kind of talking about that hierarchy of truth, about looking at things sometimes put together, I think using the phrase, let's say, the seamless garment, that all of these life issues are all related to one another. And I think the answer is that's true, but there's a way it can be misused, right?
Right. I mean, the first thing is you don't want to make a blur of all of these issues, and sometimes people just say, well, you can't rank values. Well, as I was just saying in the previous segment, you actually can rank values, and you can actually rank evils on the basis of the three criteria I talked about. Number one, ontological superiority. So, for example, killing a person is more evil than maiming a person, or killing a person is more evil than enslaving a person. Because of course at least there's life left, etc. So you can do it on the basis of ontological superiority. You can also rank values on the basis of whether something is an intrinsic evil or not an intrinsic evil. And of course, there's so many areas, right? I mean, I don't care which area we bring up with respect to peace and justice, with respect to being good stewards of the environment, with respect to the economy, with respect to immigration, with respect to all of the other issues about which the social encyclicals have been written. Now, the principles behind the social encyclicals are taught infallibly. However, the problem is when you get to the level of action, which action will actually bring about those the principles of what we call the social order. And of course, it's very, very difficult to say, what are the good consequences? What are the bad consequences, right? It's very, very difficult to say. Who's right about the economy? Who's right about health care? I mean, sometimes, some people, you can get very good people on one side of the coin saying you have to give health care to everyone right now who needs it, by this kind of a plan that funds it through debt. Okay, so you're going to fund it through indebtedness. And you get another very good person who will say in the same breath, if you keep funding it through debt, then the future generation isn't going to have health care, because of course once you surpass a certain amount of debt, right? So we're very critical point already with trillions of dollars of debt. I think 18 trillion or so. I mean, if we keep going at it, but once you get to the devaluation of a currency, that would be very bad for a future generation, and that would be a bad effect. And so they're looking at it from a different perspective. But can you actually say that one perspective is superior to another perspective? I just don't think that's possible to do, because the perspectives are different in what's called the how. Right? I mean, the objectives, you have to have the objective of providing health care for those who cannot afford it. But the hows of doing this, boy, oh boy, to try and evaluate those, and to say one is morally superior to another, virtually impossible. So how do we then make sense out of these things? I mean, we have to take a look first and foremost, are we talking about an issue that deals with an intrinsic evil or not? If it's abortion, you're going to have to make that a really important issue. Is peace and justice an issue? Yes, peace and justice is a hugely important issue. It could be so important that it could concern, right, a nuclear holocaust if you were not careful, and so forth and so on. But to say that one candidate or another is going to create a nuclear holocaust, that's a very difficult determination to make. But of course, whether abortion is an intrinsic evil, that's true. right on the face of it, what we call prima facie, it is true. But of course, on the other hand, peace and justice is a principle to be aspired to. There are many strategies to getting to peace and justice, and we have to intend to get there, right? Because that's what our church is asking us to do. But at the very same moment, it's very difficult to know which strategy, which how is going to be the best way, which candidate has the best approach is much more difficult to determine than, let's say, whether abortion is an intrinsic evil.
Right.
And so that's one thing you can do to kind of start straightening out the mess.
Right.
Which things are intrinsic evils, which things are not intrinsic evil, which things have ontological superiority and which ones don't. Now, I'm not saying that justice is not important, but life is really important because, right, without life, you know, justice is meaningless, right?
Right.
Justice is conditioned upon, you know, the human life, you know, existing and being allowed to exist. So you can say, for example, well, the most fundamental principle of justice must always be to protect the lives of the innocent. Now, you're not going to get any question about this. That is the most fundamental principle of justice, is actually the protection of life. So justice and life in this case, they're not opposed to one another. They're consistent with one another. And you can even go further with respect to this and talk about, you know, whether or not justice in this particular case, in the protection of life, what does it come down to? We call it the principle of non-maleficence. That is to say, the silver rule. Now, the silver rule is it's the one with the knots in it. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Don't do a harm, a negative to others that you don't want done to you. Now that's called ethical minimalism. That's called the principle of non-maleficence, and we'll see in a moment why it's the most fundamental principle in justice. But there's the golden rule. Now Jesus takes the knots out of the principle of non-maleficence and he turns it into what's called the principle of beneficence. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do the good for others that you would want done unto you. The sky's the limit, right? I mean, you could, you know, there are a zillion goods that we want that go far, far beyond the avoidance of harms to us, right? So Jesus has opened the door for altruism, and his principle of beneficence must include the principle of non-maleficence, right? The first order of the day, if you're going to be beneficent, the first order of the day, if you're going to do the good for another, is to not do them harm, and certainly not do them unnecessary harm, and certainly not do them unnecessary grave harm, like killing them. So, of course, when you get right down to it, does abortion have, you know, as it were, this tremendous force, you know, of prohibition against it on the basis of the principle of non-maleficence? Absolutely it does, because of course it's the unnecessary killing of a human being who is innocent, right? They haven't done anything, you know, to have any of their rights abrogated in any way, and it's the unnecessary killing of that human being. Unquestionably, it is a human being. And so for all intents and purposes, you can see, well, if we're going to pursue justice, we have to first pursue the first order of justice, and the first order of justice is life, the protection of innocent life. And of course, the protection of all life, right? I mean, you know, that's going to be absolutely important, you know, in the just order. And of course, then we can move to other injustices, right? Like injustices against liberty, injustices against property, which would be poverty, right? And of course, liberty injustices are far worse than poverty injustices, right? Because of course, when you're enslaving people, when you're controlling their minds, et cetera, you know, these are harms that prevent any kind of human flourishing from occurring. Whereas poverty, it's terrible, right? We have to be absolutely concerned about poverty, but we also have to have a ranking of justice. We have to, and of course, the ranking of rights is the ranking of justice, because an inalienable right is what is required, right, to make any human being flourish as a human being. They should have the rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson is right. And they have that intrinsic to themselves, just as human beings. When they're born into the world as human beings, it belongs to them because they deserve minimum justice.
Right.
And minimum justice is, of course, life first, liberty second, and a modicum of property to be able not to be an indentured servant, and finally the ability to pursue some form of happiness